Meeting recording. All right, we are recording this meeting now. So after the session, of course, we're going to post these slides. They're very similar to the last time that we did this, and those slides are posted on our website right now. We're also going to be recording it, and we will post the recording once it's available to us. So just wanted to let you know that. And now let's continue. We've got Kevin introduced himself. Katie, would you like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. This is Katie Wickler. I am also Market Engineering Specialist in the Market Analysis Group here at the CAISO.
All right. Thank you. Wendell, are you on the call?
Hello, Cindy. Yes, I am. This is Wendell Tamblin, and I'm the subject matter expert for cyber and BSAP.
All right. And Rodney, will you introduce yourself then, please?
Yes, my name is Rodney Jackson. I will be producing the show in the background, so I'll be helping to mute and unmute everyone and keep the chat going, so that way if you guys have questions in the chat, I can direct them to Cindy. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodney. I'm looking to see, it doesn't look like Guillermo's on the call, but Guillermo, if I don't recognize you and you are on the call, would you like to get on and introduce yourself? All right. So let's just begin. Is there anyone that I forgot, first of all, of the subject matter experts that I did not call out? Okay, well, welcome. We have this meeting scheduled for an hour and a half. We have a lot of slides, and I'd like to try and get through them so that we have a lot of time for questions. As I mentioned, we're recording this, and we're going to be posting it on the website. This is discussing our current procedures for commitment cost and default energy bid enhancements. This isn't a policy discussion per se. We're just going to talk about the procedures. We're going to go through the slides. There's also an appendix that's going to have some additional slides that you'll see that are posted. So with that, I am going to begin. So today, we are going to cover CCW, and that includes the reference level background and terminology, reference level change requests, the cyber screens that you're going to see, the after the fact cost recovery. We'll talk a little bit about auditing, what you're going to see in your CMRI reports, and fuel index calculations. These are the items that we're not going to cover, which has to do with those that are now permanent in the tariff, including the Aliso Canyon D+2 publication, the day-ahead market process to update gas prices. We're also not going to cover FERC Order 831, although there may be some training for the June release set aside, so that will be a separate subject. I don't have a date set for that yet at this point. We're also not going to be discussing CCW Phase 2. Before I move on, I want to make sure that we're clear on that, so I am going to open it up for questions on just what we are going to cover and what we're not going to cover, if there are any questions. All right, we will move along then. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the reference level background. So currently the ISO calculates cost-based reference levels, and they're used in the following situations that are listed here. So we're using them to cap commitment cost bids. And when a resources energy bid is subject to market power mitigation, we use default energy bids. We use the default energy bid when we're selling residual energy and exceptional dispatch. And the ISO produces generated bids when resource adequacy resources don't submit a bid or an incomplete bid. Oops. So what's changed? Well, previously the ISO calculated reference levels using fuel cost from external vendors are registered in the master file, and there was no opportunity for a supplier to request changes if their costs happen to differ from our calculations. So what CCW does is it enables suppliers to request adjustments to the reference levels before the market runs, and the ISO has audit authority to assure the appropriateness of those requested adjustments. And we provide after the fact recovery, after the market recovery of certain costs that couldn't be verified before the market run. So we're going to talk about how you're going to make those requests. So when we talk about the term reference levels, what we're talking about are your default energy bids, also known as DEBs, your default minimum load bids, and your default startup bids. And a reference level represents that incremental cost of operation under most circumstances. So that's a level that we're looking for. This initiative has lots of terminology associated with it, and these are just some of the terms. I'll take a look at these now, but I also, in the appendix, there are some additional definitions. So when we look at the first three, we're talking about the proxy costs, the proxy minimum load cost, proxy cost startup cost, the proxy cost transition costs. So that's the ISO's estimate of a resource's variable commitment cost. Then we've got the default minimum load bid, the default startup bid, and the default transition bid. And that is when the ISO has a calculation. It's a calculation of that resource's commitment cost bid cap using the proxy cost methodology. You can see there we have a little note that is, except for non-resource specific resources, non-generating resources, and certain use limited resources. So there's an exception to every rule, right? And then finally, we have the revised default minimum load bid, the revised default startup bid, and the revised default transition bid and revised default energy bid. And that's the ISO's that's the SC's calculation of costs using that a proxy cost methodology and increased fuel price with no commitment cost multipliers or default energy bid multipliers. So a lot of different terms, and you can refer back to this slide if you have questions. In this initiative, there are three of our different systems are impacted. There's cyber, that's the application that you submit your bids, and you're also going to use it to submit the automated ex-ante cost adjustment requests that happen before the market. So that's going to be the automated request. Then there's CMRI, which is our reporting tool for scheduling coordinators, and we're going to go over some of the reports that you're going to see in CMRI. And then CITI, that is the application that you use to submit information to the ISO and ask questions. So you're going to use CITI for the manual cost adjustment request, we'll talk about those, and to request aftermarket cost recovery, and also if there is an audit, it supports the audit process. Any questions before we move on? All right, we'll continue on. And we're going to talk about those change requests now. So we're going to start getting into the details of what it is you need to know and need to do. So scheduling coordinators may find that the reference levels that we are using don't accurately reflect their actual or expected fuel costs, which the purpose of the CCW initiative is to enable suppliers to request a reference level adjustment to update default commitment costs and default energy bids. So let's talk about how we do that. So there's two options. There's the automated option for submitting those reference level change requests and the manual option. So the first option, and the preferred option, I would say, is to use cyber. This is called the automated reference level request option. So you're going to submit a change request in Cyber prior to the close of the market, and we're going to show you the Cyber screens after we go through this. And you're going to use the following formula. So you're going to use the default proxy commitment cost formula without the commitment cost multiplier. You're going to use the variable cost based default energy bid formula without the DEB multiplier, and change only the fuel cost variable. So let me continue on. So if you send it within the time frame, the ISO systems are going to compare that request to a reasonableness threshold. We're going to talk about what the reasonableness threshold is in just a little bit. But if the request is less than or equal to the reasonableness threshold, then the request gets approved. And if the request is above the reasonableness threshold and it's timely, the requested reference level will be set to that reasonableness threshold, and then it says approved. And then beyond that, I believe you're going to submit a request for the rest. Is that correct, Kevin, for my subject matter experts?
Hi, Cindy. Yes, that's correct. If the automated request that you've submitted ends up being limited to the reasonableness threshold, you're eligible for the remainder of those costs through the aftermarket cost recovery process, which we'll discuss in a little bit, with some minor caveats that are laid out further later on in the presentation. But you're correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, so approved and partially approved values are going to be used in the next market run, and the scheduling coordinators need to maintain that supporting documentation justifying those costs. You don't need to submit them. We could potentially ask for them, so you need to maintain that documentation. So we're taking a look at Cyber here to show you what it is, how you do these requests. So you can see in the top left there, you can choose the market, day ahead or real time. And then you can see that you would choose the energy adjustment, and then you would, in the user interface, you would right click and select add product. And then you will see at the bottom, you're going to enter your information there. So it's similar to submitting a price curve for energy. So let's take a look at some examples. So here's an example of the default energy bid or default energy adjustment. As you can see here, we have a quantities and price on the price curve, and you're requesting, in this example, a new default energy bid of $500 between 32 megawatts and 48.67 megawatts. So this would be how you would reflect that in Cyber. Note there's a recommendation that says to use the CMRI report to confirm that the megawatt breakpoints match between the DEB adjustment and DEB. Oops. I think, yep, we skipped a slide there. Also, if you, this is an example of default startup cost adjustment and default minimum load adjustment request. You can see on the screen there that the default minimums, you can see there is a default load, a load adjustment, and this is the run hour, dollar per run hour value that the scheduling coordinator is requesting that their default minimum load bid be adjusted to. And then the default startup cost adjustment curve is the dollar per startup value that the scheduling coordinator is requesting that their default startup load bid be adjusted to and match. And note that these must match the cooling times of the startup cost curve defined in the GRDT. GRDT is the Generator Resource Data Template. Here's an example of a default startup bid request. And in this request, the SC is requesting a new startup bid of $22,222, and the cooling times need to match the resource data template, or RDT, and that's what you submitted to update your master file with the attributes of your resources, resource data template. That is what that is used for. Now, getting back to the concept of the reasonableness threshold. Reasonableness threshold is an ISO calculated reference level value that accounts for a margin for fuel or fuel equivalent cost volatility. And it's used to screen the automated reference level change requests that I mentioned earlier. And I'm wondering if I can get one of my subject matter experts to add on to this and talk a little bit more about the reasonableness threshold. Kevin or Katie?
Hi, Cindy. Thank you again for the prompt, and I think you did a good job in explaining it. The reasonableness threshold is kind of like a cap on how much a reference level, like a default minimum load bid or a default energy bid, can be adjusted up to. And it's meant to be somewhat of our estimate of the bid cap with a little bit of extra room added onto it to account for variability in fuel costs across different supply resources. One thing that we should note is that this reasonableness threshold isn't necessarily a safe harbor for folks to use as they see, to play around with, but rather it's meant to be a tool that can be availed of in order to adjust your default minimum load bid, for example, if you're worried that your minimum load bid itself is going to get capped. And we developed these two different values, 10% and 25%, through looking at variability in fuel costs over historic periods. And we arrived at this, these two different values. We saw that after weekends or holidays, we saw higher variability in costs, particularly compared to the prices that were trading on the day before the weekend, typically a Friday. So we accounted for that by giving a little bit more of a headroom to utilize when you're submitting your adjustments. And you'll see also that for non-gas resources, it remains the same at 10%, because we don't typically see as much variability in the fuel prices for non-gas resources.
Thank you. All right, we will move on to the next slide. Here's an example. I don't know if we want to go through it, but if so, I'm going to ask you Kevin, to jump back in and give a little summary of what these examples mean.
Sure. These two, and I won't go into the detailed explanation of how we wind up at these costs, but you'll see here that we use default minimum load as an example. We calculate the default minimum load cost or default minimum load bid to be $3,400, and that includes, our full estimate of the costs, and also the default minimum load cost is at $4,627, and that reflects our estimate of the proxy cost multiplied by a headroom, a commitment cost multiplier of 125%. And then we add in an opportunity cost for any resources that are eligible for an opportunity cost. You'll see that the reasonableness threshold has a little bit of extra room. So we take that same formula, but instead we scale the fuel region price to include 125% of the commodity price. So we've multiplied that $3 there times 1.25, you'll see that the reasonableness threshold fuel region price is 75 cents higher than the fuel region price that was used in the default minimum load cost. And then we perform the same set of calculations by multiplying the sum of those fuel costs along with the other components of the minimum load cost by 125%, and we add in the run hour opportunity cost. So that winds up with a reasonableness threshold value of $5,152. You'll see that that's a little bit higher than the default minimum load cost. So if a market participant were to submit a minimum load cost adjustment, the adjustment would be limited to the $5,152. So if you submitted at $5,000, that adjustment request would be approved. If you submitted it at $6,000, the new default minimum load cost would be equal to the reasonableness threshold, and those remaining costs would be eligible for aftermarket cost recovery, which we'll explain shortly.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, let's continue on. Oh,
Janina, we do have a question.
I'm sorry, can you state your name and ask your question?
Cindy, this is Rodney. There's a question in the chat. Are the DA and RT commodities prices published?
Hi. Yes, I can take that. Kevin Head again. Typically, the real-time prices are published on OASIS by fuel region. The day-ahead prices, we receive those, we actually extract those costs in the morning between 8 and 9 a.m. on CAISO business days. And we only get those from a single vendor. So there's some confidentiality concerns with us posting those on public sites. However, for the day ahead commitment costs and default energy bids, you can use the formulas that we provide in the attachment F and attachment D of the market instruments BPM to back into that day ahead price if you so desire. But we've had some conversations with our vendors, and this is not a new issue, but they were concerned about us publishing on OASIS, which is our public information website, the prices used in the day ahead markets because it comes from a single vendor. And that's different than the real-time costs, which are a simple average of 3 or however many vendors were available. So up to 3 different data sources for the real-time costs. There's an added complexity with weekends and holidays when the gas markets aren't trading, but I won't go into those details unless folks would like to hear about that.
All right, thank you. All right. One, I mentioned this before, and that is that when you have these automated reference level requests, you need to have the supporting documentation, although you don't need to submit it, because we can audit if we need to. So then you'll need to provide contemporaneous supporting documentation, so current documentation. If we do an audit, that request is going to be sent to the scheduling coordinator through Citi, and you'll have 5 business days to respond. And we'll ask you to provide those cost calculations and the contemporaneously available documentation that justified that request. And the ISO then will evaluate that and will respond within 10 business days of receiving your information. Then the ISO is going to respond to you and say the documentation is sufficient and you're fine and the Citi case is closed. The second option would be that the documentation does not support the change, and then the scheduling coordinators placed on an ineligibility list and won't be allowed to submit further change requests for a set amount of time. And the third response that you might get is that we need more information. And then the ISO will let you know what it is they're looking for, and the review period is put on hold. Once we receive that information, there's going to be a 10-day review period. Again,
Cindy, I have a couple of questions here if you'd like to answer them because it's about documentation. Does ICE screenshot count as valid documentation?
Kevin?
Hi, yeah, I can respond to that. And Rodney, just in the future, if you wouldn't mind reading out the name of the person who responded, just so everyone can have it. Okay, thank you. The ICE screenshots typically should be fine. Cindy, if you wouldn't mind, I don't remember where we have the documentation requirements, but it might be a few slides up or a few slides down. But the supporting documentation that needs to be provided, there's kind of a set, list of things that we need to process the request. I think it might be down the other direction.
Yep.
So just wait for that to come up. Yeah, we moved around. There it is. Great. Can you go one more slide down, please? Hold on. Let's see. Keep going if you wouldn't mind. Yes, that's great. Actually, one more down, which has some specifics.
I think that's it.
Is that the last one? Okay. Well, the Market Instruments BPM has some of the required set of documentation in it. And as long as we can determine that the ICE screenshot applies to the appropriate, trade date, and for the real-time market, we also need to have the volume of gas that's expected to be purchased. So we need things like the MMBTU amount, the price, and whether you're requesting it for the real-time market or the day-ahead market, and showing that trade date. So for example, for today, we would want to see that for the real-time market, that it's a same-day gas strip for 225, or a next-day gas that traded yesterday for 225. And then if we're talking about the day-ahead market for 226 that was traded today, we would want to see that it's for next-day gas for 226. Hope I didn't make that more convoluted, but Market Instruments BPM includes that, and yes, ICE screenshots of your costs are appropriate documentation.
And then, Kevin, one more question from Alan on that is, wouldn't it have been much easier to submit our expected gas price as opposed to having to submit minimum load cost, start cost, and deb curves only to have the CAISO reverse engineer to get the gas price?
Hi, Alan. Yeah, thanks for the question. So for manual reference level change requests, you do submit your expected gas price. For these automated requests, you do the adjustments separately for the default energy bid, the default minimum load bid, and for the default startup bid. And that's just a function of how the systems work. But yeah, point taken.
And then I have a couple more questions. Kyle Sobey asked, if we can go back to the cyber screenshots, we did not go over what the load adjustment origins as well as default startup cost adjustments origins were.
If you go one more slide back, please, Cindy.
Back.
Yes. Oh, yeah, it's actually in the CMRI section where they have the different types, but I can talk them out. So you'll see one of three types in that origin column. The first is proxy, and I think that's just if you submit a normal default minimum load or default startup bid, just plain bid. The origin will show as ex ante if you've submitted an adjustment request that is below the reasonableness threshold. So that means that your adjustment has been accepted. It was not capped at the reasonableness threshold. If it was capped at the reasonableness threshold, you'll see that origin type equal to threshold. And then that will indicate that your adjustment was limited to the threshold. And then those will eventually be passed down to CMRI. You can see your end result of the costs that were used in that particular market. And that'll have the same corresponding types, with one difference being that there's also an additional category called manual consult, which indicates that you've submitted and successfully, received a manual reference level change request, whereby we've recalculated all of your reference levels using that applied for gas price.
And we're going to run through these CMRI reports in just a bit. So I'm going to go back up to where we were. And Rodney, I think you said you had a couple other questions while I'm skipping back.
Arturo's question is, why is day-ahead gas price received by only one vendor? Why not more vendors?
Hi, Arturo. That's just the process that we've had in place for quite a while, since the Aliso Canyon changes that we did and made permanent in the CCW policy process. And we use the ICE trading platform and just pull a snapshot from that platform. And that's just the process. I'm not sure if our other vendors, NGI, SNL, and Platts, have that kind of dynamic trading platforms, but ICE is the one that we use.
Thank you. That is all the questions for now.
Thank you, Rodney. Thank you, Kevin. All right, I was just talking about the audit process and how that works, and if you're placed on the ineligibility list. And I just have one more slide on that before we move on to the manual options. So if you are on the ineligibility list, you are going to receive a written notification from the ISO, and the status begins 2 days later, meaning that you cannot submit a reference level change request. Then the ISO is going to update the master file to reflect that status. If you have an audit failure, the first one, you're going to be on that ineligibility list for 60 days following the start effective date. If you have a subsequent audit failure after that first one, then you're going to be placed on the ineligibility list for 180 days following the start effective date. You can dispute those audit results through alternative dispute resolution, known as ADR, if you do that within 5 business days. And there's a note at the bottom that says failure of simultaneous multiple audits will not result in compounded consequences. So that's, I guess, the good news of all of this. Anyway, all right, so we spent some time talking about the automated reference level change requests that you do through Cyber. Now, there's also the manual reference level change request, and you do that in City. So this process should be used when the resource reference level costs are not fully accepted through the automated process. So your first line of making your request is going to be through Cyber, and then following up with an inquiry ticket in City. And you would need to get that ticket in by 8 a.m. Pacific time on the day of that applicable market run. And we're going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to show you some city screens in a minute. So you're going to check the radio button entitled Manual Reference Level Change Request, and you're going to include the items that are outlined here: the trade date, the market, your resource ID, the requested fuel or fuel equivalent cost in dollars per MMBTU for gas resources and dollars per megawatt hour for non-gas resources. You're going to provide the volume of the gas expected to be purchased in MMBTUs and supporting documentation. The request is processed in the order it's received, and the ISO will validate the information. Requests verified prior to the day-ahead market can be used in the day-ahead market, but the requests that are verified for real-time will be used as soon as practicable. If the request can't be verified on the same trade day, it will be rejected, and scheduling coordinators could then be eligible for cost recovery if their manual request is rejected. So there's two options for submitting that reference level. Oh, I already told you that. There's two options, the automated and manual. There's one more thing we wanted to show you. In City, you need to check the manual reference level change request button. You'll see that on our screenshot here, the word change is not on there, but when you look at it in City, you will see manual reference level change request. Okay, and that makes sure that the ISO gets this and process it in a timely manner. Otherwise, it may not be looked at in the same time frame. So really important to check that box.
Cindy, I have a question here. Since you're breaking for questions, I do have a question. David Redding asked, if the automated was not done, can you still do the manual process?
This is Kevin again. Thanks, David, for the question. So our preferred method is folks try to use the automated tool first. And if they get limited to the reasonableness threshold, then they can go pursue the manual process. The automated tool is open until, for the day ahead market at least, until 10 a.m. or just right before then when we close the bidding window. The manual request window is actually earlier than that, and that has to do with the timing of when different gas prices are consumed by our systems and fed into the cyber platform. So we would recommend, first trying to get the automated tool in, or if you know that you're going to get limited to your reasonableness threshold, say your gas price was twice as high as the one that the ISO was using, then we would recommend using the manual process. So to answer your question directly, yes, I mean, you can use the automated tool, then submit a manual request, or you can just simply submit a manual request. But there are, timing issues there that need to be considered.
Thank you, Kevin. Kyle Sobey has a question. Kyle, if you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Sure.
We'll take your question.
Thank you. So I guess just a quick clarifier for myself. So the timing of this in regards to the day ahead market has me a little bit confused. I do now see that at approximately 2 a.m. Pacific, there is the initial commitment cost published out on CMRI. And are those the initial reference levels for the following day's day ahead that reasonableness threshold is being validated against? Because I never saw the 2 a.m. price that is now being published today. Prior to CCW, it was always the, 9 a.m. Pacific and then the 9 p.m. Pacific. So is that an additional set of costs that are now being published for this purpose?
Hey, Kyle. Kevin again, and thanks for the question. So the real-time prices that we get in around 9 p.m. are, take today's trade date, for example. Those are the next day prices that traded yesterday, 2/24, for today's gas flow date, 2/25. Then we do an initial publication of day-ahead costs today for tomorrow, 2/26 trade date, using those same real-time prices, which is kind of our first estimate. So we have more up-to-date prices.
Perfect.
Thank you. For most CAISO, fuel regions, we then update those prices again for the day-ahead market today, that's being executed today for tomorrow's trade date for day-ahead 2/26. We do that update between 8 and 9 a.m. And as you allude to, those are published in CMRI at 9 a.m. and are supersede the prices that were published at 2 a.m.
Understood. Thank you. Because I know that the manual reference is due at 8 a.m. Pacific, so I was just trying to make sure I understood, where that first reference is coming from prior to the 9 a.m. published costs. So I'm good. Thanks.
I have a question from Alan. So Cindy, if you can go back to slide 27. Alan's question is, what do you mean by not fully accepted through the automated process? Are you saying we have to submit via the automated process and turn around and submit again via the manual process? So Kevin, if you can clarify that, please.
Sure. Yes. So the automated process, which is through cyber, and we say automated from the CAISO's perspective. The automated process, if you have submitted a request through the cyber tool and it's limited to the reasonableness threshold, then you can come in and utilize the manual process that will allow you to, if you can submit it before that 8 a.m. window and justify that your gas prices are indeed higher than the ones that we're using, we'll prove that and allow you to submit bids that are even higher than the reasonableness threshold, which your automated requests had previously been limited to. So that's the ideal pattern. If you believe that hey, my gas price is very anomalous, and I know that I'm going to get limited to the reasonableness threshold when I submit my automated request, you can just proceed directly to the manual request. But the manual request has, I think these slides should say, if not, definitely the BPM does, there's some limits to how much higher your gas price has to be in order to be accepted in the manual consult process. It has to be 50 cents and 10% higher, with the premise being that if it was some of those smaller, say it was 40 cents, you could use the manual or the automated tool, to account for those, smaller fluctuations between your gas price and the ones that we use to calculate reference levels for all resources in our markets.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question from David. Did you get your second question answered, David Redding? Trying to unmute you now, David. While I get David unmuted, I do have a question from Tyler. If the commitment cost is capped because an entity is submitting bids reflecting a higher MMA than registered currently with DMM, will CAISO assume that is related to fuel prices, or is it proper use of the 125% scaler?
This is Kevin again. And I think I understand the question. If I'm wrong, please write in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know. But I believe the question was that can I use the CCW automated tool to submit adjustments to my bid caps, my reference levels for major maintenance costs that differ from the ones that are currently registered with the ISO and had been negotiated with our Department of Market Monitoring? The answer to that question is no. The CCW tool and process in general is focused on fuel costs. So it's really only meant to account for variability in fuel prices, whether those be gas prices or some sort of other fuel equivalent cost for non-gas resources. So the major maintenance adder doesn't fit into that category, nor would, for example, greenhouse gas emission permits or O&M costs, etc. The CCW tool is really just meant for fuel price differences.
Thank you. There is a question in the general chat from Katie, and she actually has two questions. The first question is, historically, we have made these SUC and MLC adjustments on the daily tab. With the use of the energy adjust column, will the energy adjust values now override the values on the daily column, or will we be able to retain the original values on the daily column so that both are viewable?
Yeah, I'll do that one first, and then I'll take Katie's second question after that. Cindy, if you wouldn't mind navigating a few slides back to the automated cyber screenshots. Yes, perfect. So, Katie, to your question, there's actually separate tabs that you'll be using to make these adjustments in the user interface. The energy adjustment tab only applies to adjustments to your default energy bid. That's just one component of what we call, the three-part bid. So there's the energy bid, the minimum load bid, and the startup bid. The energy, and then there's the corresponding reference levels, the default energy bid, the default minimum load bid, and the default startup bid. So the energy adjustment tab is just meant to reflect changes, requests to change your default energy bid. And then Cindy, if you wouldn't mind navigating to the next slide, please. The daily tab is for your commitment costs. So your startup cost and minimum load cost. And for this one, it's also used for the default minimum load change requests. So, when you're trying to adjust your default minimum load cost and when you're trying to adjust your default startup cost. So you'll submit almost everything that's associated with your commitment costs in this daily tab. And then your energy bid will be through the energy tab, and your default energy bid adjustment will be through the energy adjustment tab. So it's a little, confusing, but there's basically two different places that you do those adjustments. I'm not exactly sure how it works through the API, but I imagine you can just submit those all simultaneously through the API. And then going to your second question, Rodney, do you want to read it out, or I can do it?
The reasonableness, this is also from Katie. Does the reasonableness threshold change between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m.? when the fuel prices are updated?
Yep, Katie, good question. And the answer to that is yes as well. So as I mentioned to Kyle earlier, we have an initial set of reasonableness thresholds that are calculated for the day-ahead market at 2 a.m. on the morning of the day that the day-ahead market is going to be executed for trade date the next day. So we get our initial set of prices for day-ahead market 226. We get those initial set of prices at 2 a.m. in the morning, and those are factored into the reasonableness thresholds. And then again at between 8 and 9 a.m. on today, 225, we go in and update the gas prices based on the trading that we're seeing in the ICE platform. That's factored into your default costs, your reference levels, as well as the reasonableness thresholds, which are used to limit the adjustments to those default costs.
Thank you, Kevin. I have two questions from TJ in the general chat. Can the manual city ticket be for more than one resource? For example, if I have 4 peakers at a single location, can I do all 4 on one ticket?
Hi, TJ. Sorry, my voice is getting a little tired here, but it's a good question, and we understand in the morning there are time limitations, and we are willing to say yes to this request and plan on updating the BPM to reflect that. The caveat being that, just as your time is constrained in the morning, our team has to process a number of these requests between 8 and 8:30 in the morning. So as long as when you submit a request that it's easy to tell the 4 different resource IDs that are being requested for change, and obviously those resources face the same fuel costs, which I imagine they would, then the answer to that would be yes. But we just kindly ask that the request is as explicit as possible. And one thing that maybe I wasn't specific about is that the requests are at the resource ID level. So if it's a multi-stage generator, you can just submit the resource ID. Or if it's 4 different units that are located at the same place but have 4 different resource IDs, as long as you spell out each of those resource IDs and it's clear to us that the request is for each one of those, then the answer to your question is yes.
And then, Kevin, I believe TJ's follow-up question is related to that. Is it true that the city application still does not have an API, and therefore an SC with 50 gas resources may have to manually submit 50 city tickets each morning?
I am not sure about whether City has an API. I do not believe that it does, but I can't answer the first part of your question. But to your second question, the answer is that yes, if those are 50 gas resources that are separate, separately located and are facing different gas prices, in that case, unfortunately, you would have to submit 50 different tickets. In that case, though, we would certainly recommend that you use the API that feeds into Cyber so that you can have a record of your actual or expected fuel costs prior to the running of the market, and so you get in line effectively for the aftermarket cost recovery process, if indeed we can't process your manual requests in time. So the Cyber application is automated, whereas this manual process is manual. It's myself and Katie and a few other colleagues who process these requests looking at the supporting documentation ahead of time. So it's just an unfortunate circumstance of how the process works.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question from Emmy. Is the energy adjustment incremental or a new proposed final energy bid?
Gotcha. It's a good question as well. And let me just clarify some terms here. We sometimes use the term incremental bid, incremental energy bid, to mean, the typical energy bid that you submit that is between your PMIN and your PMAX. So this energy adjustment doesn't apply to that. It only applies to adjusting your default energy bid. But what I think your question means is, say that your default energy bid has just one segment and it's $50, and you would like to adjust it to be $70. You should submit the final $70 as your adjustment, and not just the $20 difference between your request of 70 and your original default energy bid of 50. So instead it should be for the entire $70 for that one segment. If that's not what you were asking, just please comment in the chat. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you. I have a general question in the general chat from Jacob. For the manual adjustments, do you need only to supply the updated fuel price, or do you also need to provide the final calculations for energy commitment costs, et cetera, using your requested fuel price?
Yeah, I understand the question as well. And the answer is you are submitting just your updated fuel price. But when I say just your updated fuel price, there's also some additional information requirements that we need to process your request, which are spelled out in the BPM, and are things like, trade date, the hub, and of course the supporting documentation. But the price that you should be submitting to us is the commodity price that you're paying, meaning you're not including any transportation costs to get from the gas trading hub to your supplier, your generator location. But no, you don't need to include the final calculations of those costs if you're doing the manual process. Once we have that updated fuel price, say it's a gas price, we will feed that price into our formulas and recalculate your commitment costs and default energy bid based on those predefined formulas. And then that will be used to then limit how much you can submit for your minimum load and startup bids, and it'll also recalculate your default energy bid. And the formulas for those are spelled out in attachment O of the market instruments BPM. So you can see more about them there. Thanks.
All right, Paul asks, where can we find the 9 a.m. fuel price?
Hi, Paul. This is Kevin Head. Unfortunately, as I said, the 9 a.m. price is one that we get from the Intercontinental Exchange, ICE, and we pull that down just from their trading platform. And because it comes from a single vendor, we're unable to publish that publicly. But what you can do is go to your CMRI reports, for example, the default commitment cost report, and back into that number using the formulas. I know that it's not an ideal situation, but there were some confidentiality concerns around sharing that data. And those are the 9 a.m. prices that you'll see.
Thank you. I have a question from Andrew in the general chat. If there is no traded price on ICE, but simply elevated bids and or offers, how will CAISO treat that?
Hi, Andrew. I think this question could be taken in two different ways. One, we take the traded price from ICE and use that as an input into your reference levels. If there is no price when we go in and pull the data between 8 and 9 a.m. for the day-ahead market, then we fall back to the most recently available price. And that is effectively how your commitment costs get updated, or in this case, don't get updated. If that's what you're asking, then we have effectively a fallback logic. The other option is, the other question, I guess, would be, from your perspective, if you're not seeing any trades on ICE, how should you submit your reference level change requests? And if that's what you're asking, we ask that you submit your expectations of your fuel price if you don't know your actual fuel price. So if you base your expectations on ICE and there's no trades, then we would ask that you submit whatever your expectation of it would be. So saying you're seeing offers of $5 and bids of $4, maybe you split the difference and it's $4.50. You just have to explain that to us, that our expectation of what our fuel price will be $4.50, and here's the trades on ICE that we're seeing. So I'm not sure which question you're asking, but hopefully I helped.
David Redding asks, does the CMRI price for gas lag 1 day?
Hi, David. It differs between real-time and day-ahead. For the real-time market, we're posting those prices on Oasis the night before the real-time market begins, I believe. And then the prices that are reflected in your default energy bids and commitment costs for the real-time market are the prices that were posted the night before. So in that way, I guess it kind of lags a day. But for the day-ahead market, I guess I'm not sure how to answer your question, David. If you wouldn't mind, restating it or putting some specifics in, I can answer.
If you can type into the general chat or unmute, we can answer that for you. And then while we get that, Kevin, we have a question from Alan. So back in your previous example, in the example of no trades but elevated bids, should we use the manual process?
So can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes. Alan asks, so in the example of no trades but elevated bids, should we use the manual process?
We would hope that you would use the automated process first to reflect your expected fuel costs. And then if the automated process limits your adjustment, then you can approach us, you will approach us with a manual request. If there's no trades on ICE, we would expect that you would tell us what your expected fuel costs are. And how you develop the expectation for your fuel prices is not something that we have transparency into until you tell us how you've developed those expectations. So I'm not sure if I responded to your question, but that's the best I can do. If you feel that that wasn't adequate, I'm happy to respond further.
Rodney, how many more questions do we have? I'd like to get through I see some of the questions have to do, at least one has to do with CMRI. And so I'd like to get through the presentation, but if there's only a few more questions, we can just run through them.
I have 4 more questions currently.
Okay. All right. Let's see how we get through it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Taylor asks, in a volatile market, is it possible to submit multiple updates for the same trade date to reflect the changing fuel price?
So, hi Taylor, Kevin Head again. Taking it day ahead versus real time. For the day ahead market, our bidding window closes at 10 a.m. on the day before the electricity flows. So, you know, you can submit multiple automated requests anytime up to that 10 a.m. close of the market. For manual requests, we don't field any more requests after 8 a.m. because we have our own internal processes that need to run in order to allow for sufficient time for the new fuel prices to be reflected in everybody's reference levels. So, you know, if you submit, you can, I guess, hypothetically submit multiple manual requests in the morning as long as they're in before 8 a.m. Though, you know, we would only use the most late, you know, the most recent request. For the real-time market, and you know, you can submit an adjustment for any hour through the day, or your, you know, updated bid caps or default energy bids. So if hour ending 11, you're expecting fuel prices of $10, but then the same day prices continue to increase, such that at hour ending 14, you're seeing higher prices. You can use the automated tool to reflect those higher prices. But again, the real-time manual process ends at 8 a.m. as well. So the answer, I guess, broadly is yes, you can submit multiple requests, but any manual requests have to be in before 8 a.m. on that particular trade date.
Last 2 questions I have here. This one's from J.A. Wright, and it's in the general chat. Does the CMRI report for default commitment costs include the proxy times 1.25 plus energy costs, or is it just the proxy plus opportunity costs?
It will be proxy times 1.25 plus your opportunity costs. So it's the former rather than the latter. And that's spelled out further in the market instruments BPM attachment if you'd like to see the details of the calculations.
Thank you, Kevin. And Kyle, if you want to go ahead, Kyle Sobey, if you want to unmute and ask your question about the energy adjustment.
Sure. Kyle Sobey from Tenasca here again. So just for clarification on my end, when you submit the energy adjustment, you are, you know, submitting a change to your default energy bid. However, let's say for whatever reason, your actual energy offer that you're bidding on the normal hourly tab, if you were to leave that at a lower gas price because you were focused on getting your DEB updated on the energy adjustment tab, your offer is still based purely on the hourly tab, correct? Like if I had a $20 offer there, adjusted my energy adjustment to 500, but didn't then realize that my offer didn't get brought up alongside, all the adjustment is the DEB. So if you were to be mitigated, that's what you're mitigated down to. So you still have to make sure that your 2 bids are kind of representing the same thing.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, just
the
making sure.
DEB adjustment is, yeah, it's independent of your energy bid. And the reason for that is the energy bid cap is currently set at 1,000, and with 831, there's some changes happening there, which I won't go into. but your default energy beta adjustment is just for that DEB, which, as you mentioned correctly, is used in the market power mitigation process and in some other related downstream processes in our settlement systems.
Thank you.
Cindy, that concludes the questions that I have.
I see one more from Katie from Brittany. Sorry,
Katie, yeah.
this one's super quick. Thanks, Katie, for your question. Yes, the 8 a.m. deadline for Citi is for the day ahead. So if you were talking about trade date 2/26, so Friday's day ahead, the electricity flow date Friday 2/26, that request would have had to be in by 8 a.m. this morning, 2/25. And then for manual requests for the real-time market 2/25, those requests also would have had to been submitted before 8 a.m. today. Hope that helps.
Yep, just like the close 8 a.m. before the close of the day ahead market for the next day.
Yep.
All right, lots of great questions. So let's get through a few more slides. We have about 15 minutes or so left. I think we can get through it. All right, we're going to talk about the reference level documentation. Oops. And so the scheduling coordinators must submit the total reference level value, and that must be calculated using the proxy cost methodology for default commitment costs and variable cost-based methodology for default energy bids without including that commitment cost multiplier or DEB multiplier. The resource characteristics or the attributes need to match what's in the master file, and reference level values should include the following components, and you can see them all there. So I'll let you take a look at that. Moving on to the next slide. The documentation must be available justifying the increase in fuel costs. So they must be based on the prevailing costs. When we're talking about day ahead, shows that the price is based on the next day procurement, and real time shows that the price is based on same day or next day procurement. For non-standard gas trading days, the fuel price must be the most recent available, and it needs to reflect prudent procurement practices. As we kind of looked at this before, the supporting documentation could include quotes from natural gas suppliers, gas purchase invoices, evidence of a bid price that was part of an unsuccessful good faith effort to purchase fuel, or other appropriate documentation demonstrating fuel or fuel cost equivalence. We're going to talk about our aftermarket cost recovery. Now, request for aftermarket cost recovery is available for to recover additional costs under certain predefined circumstances. The reasons for this are that the SC could be because the SC made an automated reference level change that exceeded that reasonableness threshold, so it was automated, so it was done in cyber, or the ISO was unable to verify the manual request due to issues on our side. So we didn't have enough time to approve the request. Again, there's a note here that says that that aftermarket cost recovery process is not intended to be a process for SCs to recover any costs. It's eligibility to qualify only certain fuel or fuel equivalent costs that can be recovered through this process. So what are the conditions for aftermarket cost recovery? And you can see them listed here. The scheduling coordinator submitted a manual request, which was not approved, or an automated request, which exceeded the reasonableness threshold. The aftermarket cost recovery submission is made within 30 days of the trade date that the resource incurred those unrecovered costs. And the unrecovered costs must be based on actual incurred fuel or fuel equivalent cost, not the expected cost. And there is a note at the bottom here saying if the automated request was based on expected costs and the resource's actual costs exceeded these expected costs, these additional costs are not eligible for cost recovery. And of course, we're looking for that supporting documentation as well. So if you are submitting that recovery request through Citi, you want to make sure that the inquiry ticket has a subject of aftermarket cost recovery so that it's routed appropriately. So it should include the resource ID, the trade date, the market, the requested fuel or fuel equivalent, which is dollars per MBP. It seems like I've mentioned this all before. Dollars per MBTU for gas resources or dollars per megawatt hour for non-gas resources, the supporting documentation, the requested cost components for DEB, minimum load, startup, and transition costs. Additionally, the cost has to include your supporting documentation, the data and calculations that support your claim to the unrecovered costs, and an explanation of why aftermarket cost recovery is justified. A little more on the aftermarket cost recovery process. The ISO will then review your request and determine your cost recovery eligibility within 60 days after the trade date. If it's eligible, if the costs are eligible, the costs will appear on the next possible settlement statement in your bid cost recovery charges. If it's not eligible, we will provide a written explanation. If the ISO is unable to verify that cost eligibility within 60 days, we will provide the scheduling coordinator with a 30-day extension to file cost recovery request with FERC. And if ISO rejects an aftermarket cost recovery, scheduling coordinator again may file cost recovery with FERC. I'm going to skip this break for questions because I think we just have a few more slides left, and then we'll have final questions and move on. So this is just a little preview of what's in CMRI. If you go to CMRI, the Customer Market Results Interface, which is the reports that our scheduling coordinators get, there is a report called Default Energy Bid Curves. And there are some changes to the screen, and Kevin talked about these different types, the default bid types, the manual consult, and ex ante and threshold, which are now new on the screen. You'll note the interval start time and interval end time, as well as the publication timestamp, which was added after the last column. Another set of reports or report is the default commitment costs, which are the minimum load cost, startup and transition costs. And you can see that the commitment cost type on these reports could be manual consult, threshold, ex ante, proxy. And when we look at the minimum load costs, you can see a note there that says the dollar value shown in CMRI will now represent the default cost, not the proxy cost. For unadjusted amounts, the values shown here are now 125% of the proxy cost of the resource.
Hey,
Kevin,
Cindy.
did you want to add something?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. And just to fill out the point that you just made, you'll see here that it says for unadjusted amounts, the values are 125% of the proxy cost. If you've submitted a reference level change request, whether it be automated or manual, or whether it was limited to the threshold, those, as also Cindy mentioned earlier, should be reflective of only your resource's total cost, with no multiplier applied to it. Just to reinforce and connect what she was saying earlier about what the reference level change request should represent, and then what's being shown here. But ultimately, the default commitment cost report will show your default costs, meaning the amounts to which your minimum load or startup bids will be limited to, rather than the proxy cost, which is what it included previously, which was just 100% of the unadjusted costs. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're just about done here. So we're going to wrap up just this is your final questions. There are some references here that when we post the presentation, you will have available to you. We talked about attachment O, the cyber user guide, a city user guide, and also stakeholder process documents for CCW. Now I'm going to stop here for final questions. I'm also going to ask Rodney to please put in the chat a link to our to our survey, a course evaluation for this initiative. So are there any final questions? Okay, it looks like Aaron, you'd like to ask a question. Do you want to take yourself off mute?
Yes, please. I appreciate it. This is easier to say than to type. So my question is particular to, let's say we have a volatile market like we witnessed last week in the natural gas sector. So we were looking at easily $100 plus moves in market mids in just 20 to 30 minutes in the market. And say bid-ask spread is very wide. An SC has not transacted by 8 a.m. PPT, but it sees that there's clearly a huge disparity between yesterday's gas price and today's gas price, or what we would assume the reasonableness threshold would be. So as a precaution, you can submit an automated reference level change request using maybe the current ask on the screen, which I'm assuming is fair. But what if an SC is able to transact after the fact between 8 and 9, and it does transact less than the ask at the point where it submitted the reference level change request? So now you have defaults going into the market that are actually greater than it was able to transact with after the deadline. How would that be handled?
Aaron, thank you for the question. So maybe if I can put some numbers around it, which will help me think through your question, and I may not be able to answer it at this moment, but I think I do understand what you're asking. So say at 7:45 a.m. Pacific time, you're seeing a lot of volatility in the market. So you go into cyber and adjust your, request an adjustment to your costs, reflecting a ask price of, say, $120. After the 8 a.m. window comes and goes, you end up procuring gas at $100. So now that you have a request in at $120 and your actual costs were $100. Is that the scenario that you're outlining?
Correct.
Gotcha. You can, the reason why I'm hesitating is there's some interplay with the audit discussion that I have to think through. So I'll ask if you wouldn't mind submitting that question via a city ticket, and I can respond when I have a little bit more time to consider the different inputs to your question. But sure. It's a good question and something that I just haven't considered. So thank you.
Will do.
Okay, Taylor asked if we could share that response with the rest of the participants. And yes, Kevin, if you copy me in on that, I'll make sure that we send that out to everybody who put their email address in when they signed into this webinar.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We'll do. And Cindy, if I could just make one brief announcement. So thanks everybody for all these questions. And we're planning on doing another set of revisions to particularly attachment O of the market instruments BPM, though we might also edit some other sections. Some do come to mind in response to a lot of the questions that we've been getting over the past week and a half So we'll be sure to cover this scenario in the edits that we do to the market instruments BPM.
Looks like we have a final question from Jacob. If you, it is, can you still submit a manual request via city ticket after 8 a.m. for next day offers? If not, would you still be eligible for bid cost recovery if you submitted a manual request after 8 a.m. but before market close?
Hi, Jacob. Unfortunately, the manual request cutoff time is 8 a.m. And without getting too much into the weeds, it has to do with the processes that we have, both from like a manual reviewing of the request and then our systematic calculations that run and complete in time for folks to be able to adjust their bids. And the second question is, would you still be eligible for bid cost recovery if you submitted after the 8 a.m. deadline? And the answer to that is also unfortunately no. To be considered a manual reference level change request, it has to come in before 8 a.m. That's not to say that you don't have any options though. The option is you can come in and submit an automated request, and if it gets limited to the reasonableness threshold, then you can come in afterwards and request for aftermarket cost recovery, which will then flow through the bid cost recovery process. The downside is that those costs don't get reflected in the market, but if you do the appropriate steps, then you should be eligible for bid cost recovery.
Looks like there were 2 more questions, Rodney, if you want to.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, Alan has a question regarding the last slide, but while we get to that, actually, you can go back to the last slide. Alan, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Actually, it's the next slide. Go one more.
Oh, you're talking this way.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Yes, so what you say here, for unadjusted amounts, the values here will be reflected 125%. Said differently, are you saying the adjusted bids or the bids we submit through the automated process will not be 125%?
Hey, Cindy, would you mind going a few slides back to, I think it's just before this end of the beginning of the CMRI. It's before the aftermarket cost recovery to, sorry, I just don't have the slides with me. Yes, actually, yes, right here. Shoot, one more.
One more.
Oh.
Nope. This one?
Darn.
What did,
I wish I had the slide. But to answer your question, if you submit an adjustment through Cyber, say, the adjustment that you submit should be reflective of 100% of your costs. So if your cost expectation is $100 per run hour, then that's what you should enter into the adjustment in Cyber. So in that case, and that value would ultimately be reflected in CMRI. So in that case, you're not including any 125% multiplier in that case. It's simply just reflective of your expectation of your costs, and thus, your default minimum load bid adjustment or whichever reference level. Did that make sense, or did I mangle that?
I'm a bit confused because I thought when we spoke a week ago that we could submit our bids to the automated process reflecting only the gas price, and that after 8 a.m. that would eventually make its way to the CMRI default commitment costs, which would then include 125% on what we submitted if it was accepted. And I'm hearing now that that's not the case.
Yeah, if that's what we said, then that's incorrect. When you submit an adjustment, it becomes what we call a revised default minimum load bid or a revised default energy bid. And the revised formulas should not include the 125% multiplier. And they won't in CMRI display that value either. And I think, Cindy, the slide that I was referring to is 33, I think. The top of it says scheduling coordinators must submit the total. I'm looking at a different version. Yeah, this one. So this slide is meant to say, you know, I guess we didn't really explain it fully, but it shouldn't include the commitment cost multiplier or the debt multiplier when you submit your requests via Cyber. And then CMRI, which just effectively shows what Cyber shows, will also show that same value, thus not reflecting the 125% multiplier.
All right, it looks like we have one last question from Mark Smith. We're kind of over time here. He's got 2 comments, looks like 1 question. And it is, if you receive an exceptional dispatch midday after the 8 o'clock deadline in real time, how can you reflect your actual intraday gas price? And this question assumes no day ahead or real-time commitment in the market, only an exceptional dispatch.
Hi, Mark. I might just have to ask you to kindly submit this question via Citi so we can get back to you on it. I don't want to go too far over time, and frankly, I don't know if I have all the information to respond to your question either. So I'd appreciate it if you could follow up via an inquiry ticket in Citi.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And I think this has been a really informative question. Lots of great questions. I'd really encourage you to please take the survey. I will be also sending it in an email about the training, just so we can give you the best quality training that we have. We love to hear your thoughts. It was great session. So thank you very much. And you will be getting an email from me with some of these responses, as well as a link to that survey also. So have a great day, and we will say goodbye. Thank you.